The Gwart Show is sponsored by Ellipsis Labs. Ellipsis Labs is building a world where mainstream finance happens on-chain. Their first product, Phoenix, is a fully on-chain limit order book DEX on Solana doing hundreds of millions of dollars in volume. I know this team personally. It's one of the strongest in the space. If you're interested in working with a team that's here to stay, Ellipsis Labs is hiring engineers passionate about DeFi to join their team. You can find Ellipsis Labs on Twitter at ellipsis_labs or head to ellipsislabs.xyz to learn more and apply. Hey guys, I'm here today with Mert from Helius. Mert's probably, I would say, the mouthpiece of Solana, but is one of the, most vocal and probably understands Solana about as well as anybody you're going to find. So we're going to have him introduce himself, although I'm hoping that most of you guys know who he is.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Mert, CEO of Helius, not Helium or Helium or Helios. So Helius is a development platform on Solana. If you're coming from the EVM world, maybe it's some like a mix of Infura, Alchemy, QuickNode, and maybe Consensus a little bit. And I also shitpost a lot.
Yes, you do. You just got back from ETHCC. First of all, what do you do there? Out of curiosity, like when you go to ETHCC, what is your angle? Like, are you just shilling Solana IRL?
You'd actually be surprised. Obviously at first I didn't have any plans to go, but the Celestia guys for the modular summit were like, "Hey, do you want to come and roast us? Do you want to do like this modular roast?" And I was like, "Okay, sure, works for me. Free ticket." So that was like, and so I announced it, but then I started getting invited to other events. So I did another talk. At the time we released DK compression, which maybe is considered modular. So they wanted me to talk about that. And then Monad then found out that I was going, so they wanted me to give a few talks. And then Lane from Ethereum or Ethereum Foundation invited me to the main event to debate modular versus monolithic with like Mega ETH, Monad, and like Christine Kim and Galaxy. And then just kind of kept getting invited to like a bunch of side events and stuff. And I think, at least compared to from what I've heard from last year, is that people were a bit more upset with Ethereum's, let's say, roadmap and future direction. People were perhaps a little confused. And so actually people were coming to me, like the founders of a good amount of chains, and asking like, how did you guys do it on Solana? Like, would this work? Like, what are some things you learned, et cetera? So actually I was almost there as an agent of support, let's say. Like, people were just asking me questions of like, how did Solana do this? How did you guys do this? What are you excited about, et cetera? So I never actually got to shill Solana, really, because I feel like it'd be weird to shill Solana people who don't want to be shilled Solana. But I did try to help on like, you probably need some cohesive messaging. Obviously, some infra stuff. We can get into the weeds later. The value of like building apps and not infrastructure, and just generic stuff that everybody who follows me on Twitter will have heard me say anyways.
Yeah. I mean, so you touched on the apps versus infrastructure. We can talk about that a bit more later, but what would you say were your main takeaways, right? I interviewed Max Resnick yesterday, and he had some takeaways. Like, he actually seemed, I would say, surprisingly bullish. He told me if you'd asked me about the roadmap 3 months ago, I would have been probably bearish, but I felt like the conference was very successful. I heard maybe the opposite from some people. So I don't know. What were your main takeaways?
As a disclaimer, I had never been to an Ethereum conference before this. I mean, I went to token and maybe chain agnostic ones. And so I don't have a frame of reference. But basically my takeaway, and I wrote about this, is that I actually thought it was a really well executed event in many cases. The one thing was there was a lot of side events, and those side events were from, let's say, like a Bear Chain or a Monad, and then you would have one with Arbitrum, but then Optimism would have one at the same time, and then Base would have one at the same time. And so I used to criticize maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, Ethereum about liquidity fragmentation. But then I kind of updated that view kind of maybe a year and a half ago to, I don't think liquidity fragmentation is actually the problem. I think the much more interesting problem is social fragmentation. And, maybe that's why the term alignment came, because it's on Solana, let's say you're like a team like Helios or Jupiter, let's say something on Solana breaks. Everybody on the chain has the same incentive to fix that part of the chain. So for example, congestion happened like 4 or 5 months ago and the chain basically barely worked. And everybody had the same goal in mind of fixing that problem. And so the problem was fixed relatively soon or quickly. On Ethereum though, since it's basically to date maybe been messaged as a platform for rollups, and then it should be like incredibly neutral, unopinionated, and then, you've been added blob space for DA so that rollups can really utilize it. You then have all these teams using Ethereum as the base layer. Teams also have their own, right? Maybe Arbitrum and Base maybe want to do L2s and own the customer relationship a bit more. Optimism wants to do super chain. The ZK rollups want to do their own thing and then sue each other over like names and whatnot. And so once there's a problem on the base layer, then it's very hard to get these people to agree on any way forward. And so what ends up happening is something of like a crippling effect. So I think social, and by the way, I do think it's a bit overplayed, like because it's the current thing on Twitter. I don't think it's like an unfixable problem. Like I think it is fixable. You just need like a few strong leaders like Max, Vitalik, and a few other folks to kind of just say a compelling vision and then just convince people to join that vision. So I think it's a fixable problem, but that is one thing I noticed. So like all the events were like super, like some people were here, but then you couldn't meet with them. So you had to go to another event and it was just like super, let's say paralyzed in terms of people and whatnot. But the events themselves are super high quality and full of quite smart people. Actually, the modular summit was very well done, I thought. They had like a really nice venue, really smart people talking about, interesting stuff. I was talking like Mustafa from Celestia, and he was, telling me their findings and stuff. So I think it was quite productive and like cross-collaborative. I saw like, here's what we learned from Solana. Maybe you guys can take this away, and then vice versa. And so I think once that's social, and by the way, like, for example, Victor from Coinbase disagrees with me on this, and he thinks it's like a good thing that the social layer is maybe a bit more independent and maybe it's like a more of a free market dynamic. So I don't really know the right answer, but that's just the one main thing that I noticed. And I would say like, I don't know if it's just the market conditions or whatnot, but it was also quite friendly. Like, in fact, I was at a modular monolithic debate and I went on a rant about like, these hardware requirements that Ethereum kind of has that are like maybe arbitrarily low, which I'll probably get roasted for saying that. But anyways, I went on a rant about that at this thing. And at the end, people were applauding it. And the people are Ethereum people. I was like, this is kind of weird. And so maybe people actually do, or have turned some corner into be more like Max aligned in a sense.
Yeah. I mean, you say like, this is not an unfixable problem, and it's probably true, but do you feel like these fragmented communities are wanting to come back together in a sense? Like, I guess there's been a lot of talk about like improving the L1, right? Like faster block times, multiple proposers, right? Like it seems like there is some camp now that is moving increasingly towards like, let's improve the L1. Like, how do you feel the sentiment is from your angle from like these L2s? Like, do you think like they have incentive to work together, or is this sort of like a pipe dream?
Well, I think maybe one example is Polygon's egg layer, where, other L2s and ZKs rollups can kind of come in and plug into this thing. And so in some sense, we'll see empirical data of how effective that is. Based on what I've seen just from Twitter in, let's say, Farcaster, people do seem to have animosity towards each other still. I mean, there's some history, of course, of some of these teams, maybe some alignment politics behind the scenes as well. But fundamentally, they're basically all venture-backed startups with different cap tables and different incentives, and they need to return capital somehow to their investors. And so that makes it quite difficult. So you need to have like a common enemy that everybody agrees is some sort of common problem that actually needs to be solved for things to move forward. And I mean, like the other day, I believe ZK Sync like released this graphic, and it was like, ZK Sync does this much TPS, Superchain does this much TPS, and I'm like, Polygon egg layer does like 3 TPS. And like even I commented and I was like, how could it do 3 TPS? It's a thing. It's an aggregation layer. You can't do so like, and then like StarkNet was talking about like their time to finality is like 2 seconds yesterday. And I was like, that's not necessarily possible. And other people commented on that too. So I do think it's a short-term difficult problem, and you need some sort of, and I think this is probably the reason why Vitalik is much more active than before. I think at some point you need kind of the benevolent dictator or like just good storyteller types that are actually technical and know what they're saying, unlike, maybe I won't name names, but I think everyone knows what I'm talking about. Those types to kind of unite smart people and tell them like a good way forward. I think Paradigm is also trying this as well. So, there's some progress, but ultimately I'll just look at kind of the data and see like, Polygon egg layer, how many people are using that, Superchain, etc. Do these people actually want to work together? But it'll be hard.
Do you think that Ethereum is moving in the direction of Solana? Like, do you feel that they have been influenced? I think, so I'll tell you this for some context. Like I was saying, I was talking to Max yesterday, and he said, like, look, we need to be honest. We're losing users. We are losing users to Solana. They want to trade meme coins there, and we need to take that back. What degree of, I guess, severity from the Ethereum side, or maybe urgency is a better word, do you feel like there is an underlying sense of urgency to compete, and on the premise that like these other, probably most specifically Solana, but like these other alt L1s are capturing market share from us?
So I remember, I'm not sure if it was Charlie or somebody from Paradigm basically said some list of criteria that they want to hit for Ethereum. And at the time, I quote tweet, and by the way, I'm not like super familiar with Ethereum's entire roadmap other than like the very obvious ones. And so my knowledge here is limited, but basically what I said was, I don't think it's the right approach. And what I said was, you're never going to be a better Solana than Solana, but you can easily be a better Ethereum. And so that is to say, you don't want to compete with Solana because Solana has been designed like this from the ground up, and the entire ethos of the ecosystem teams, core teams, investors, community members is all centered around that same idea of this global stake machine being super fast and low latency and whatnot. And a ton of the Ethereum, let's say, ecosystem is just not like that. And they're much more centered around, home staking, autonomy, and roll up central roadmap and whatnot. And so I don't think it makes sense, or maybe it makes sense, but I don't think it's a good idea to try to compete with somebody that is already quite good at that one thing. I think certainly there are improvements you can make on the L1, right? That is not to say the L1 should not be touched. Like I used to joke that like, why are we working on L2s when L1s don't even work? Because like Solana is still fundamentally, it's quite, people maybe from the outside think it's like this great chain, but like Solana has a lot of problems. Like currently you still can't get 1 slot latencies for transaction landing. There's no formal spec. Consensus is not defined. There's a lot of weird issues with the RPCs. Like there's just a lot of issues. And so, and by the way, like Sui and Aptos and all these other L1s are also trying to be Solana basically, in a sense, and a better Solana. And so Ethereum already has a fundamental niche that is carved out, and it's, there's also this thing like make Ethereum great again. And I think that's like super counterproductive because you're basically saying Ethereum right now is bad. We're the number 1 market cap in smart contract platforms. We have all the users and EVM is king, but Ethereum sucks and we're going to make it great again. Because when you say that, you're implying that there's something else better out there. And so you're basically doing Solana's marketing for Solana. And so I think maybe, I'm not sure what the technical changes would be on a, let's say, precise level or a sequential level. But, obviously, getting rid of some arbitrary like home staking requirements and trying to maybe scale the L1 a little bit more. Like, I'm not sure if shorter block times, I don't know the work required. I haven't done the work required to have an opinion that's meaningful there. but I don't think it makes sense to compete with Solana on Solana's playground. I think the roll-up centric roadmap does make sense. I think it's a good roadmap, and I do think that to maximize the probability of a crypto future, all these different teams need to explore different paths, and I think the roll-up centric roadmap kind of enables that much better. Whereas on Solana, it's like one way forward in a sense.
Thanks for listening to The Gwart Show on the Blockspace Podcast Network. Subscribe to our newsletter at blockspace.media to get the show directly to your inbox. Show links, transcripts, and Bitcoin articles twice per week. Stay ahead of the conversation by visiting blockspace.media.
What do you think about base sequencing? Like our friend Eugene calls this Solana at home. I think this is a pretty, it's like a very poignant way to say this. But so we're talking about the roll-up centric roadmap, but then like if we see some shift toward base sequencing, like to me this appears like an attempt to compete with Solana, but it does seem like this is getting more traction, even though I don't know the implementation details are like, spec'd out yet, but like this seems to be moving in this direction. And then also I'd add one other thing too, just like maybe if you have a spicy take, you may not, but like, I asked this to Max as well, and that's why I'm like asking various people these same questions. Like, do you feel that like base sequencing could be sort of a rug of L2s that built out, that designed with a certain goal in mind, and now Ethereum community is to some extent drawing what they thought, their design space was going to be, kind of drawing it back into the L1?
Yeah. So first question is what I think about base sequencing. Actually, interestingly, right around the time, like the day that base sequencing like forum post came out from like Justin Drake, and by the way, C-Node says he invented it. So when I talked to him, it might be his idea. The day it came out, I was actually trolling L2s for like the centralized sequencers, and then C-Node replied to me like, okay, so just don't use a sequencer. I was like, what the fuck does that mean? And so he was talking about base rollups, and they had just came out that day, or at least the idea. So I read up on it, and I thought it was actually quite good. And then kind of my second thought was, okay, why not use this on Solana, right? 400 millisecond block times. Why are you doing all these weird things to get all this stuff down when you can just use a chain that's maybe better suited for base sequencing? And then actually, I think maybe it might have been Max that I was talking to. And I think the counter was something like, okay, in 2022 or 2021, when you were using the chain, how often did it really matter that the block time was 12 seconds, right? Like if you're already doing everything on the rollup, let's say like a perp exchange or like an aggregator or whatever, did you really need the block time to be like, oh, I wish it was half this or something? Like it's more of a UX issue. And so I'm not sure how that plays out, but I fundamentally think based rollups are a great idea. I did put out a tweet maybe a year ago saying, if you're building a base rollup on Solana, shoot me a deck. And I still feel that way. I think the idea is good. Okay, and then the second question is like, does this rug L2s, the existing ones, let's say? Well, that's kind of just startups and just how capitalism works in a sense. Like, I don't want to get too philosophical, but if you don't adapt to the market will kind of end you, right? Like you just kind of have to see these things. I mean, the forum post has been there for a long time, and so people would have seen this coming. It's not like it just dropped on the last second. And in fact, I had the Arbitrum guys on my podcast about 7-8 months ago, and I was talking to them. I was like, okay, you guys are doing like an optimistic rollup. Why not do a ZK rollup if that's kind of the future? And basically their response, I believe, I'm paraphrasing, was something like, we don't think of Arbitrum as like an optimistic rollup. We think of it as like scaling tech for Ethereum. And so I would actually just expect those guys to also do some sort of a base rollup in a sense, because it seems like they keep launching like horizontal product segments to scale Ethereum. Same with Optimism. So I don't think it actually rugs them. I think it probably actually gives them more of a playground and kind of more shots at the goal in a sense. But I wouldn't say, I don't think they rug those L2s. Now, those L2s have their own problems, right? The fact that those sequencers are still super centralized, and if you go on L2b.com and kind of they're basically none of them are at stage 2, that's a problem, which Vitalik seems to call out now as well. And so I guess time will tell, but anyway, maybe the TLDR of this is that I think base sequencers, base rollups make sense, and you should build them on Solana.
What are you really excited about on Solana right now?
So I'm excited about three things. One is this new thing called Blinks, blockchain links, that kind of we released, and by we, I mean Solana Foundation and Dialect, which is basically forecaster frames, but generalized to the internet in a sense, like wherever you can have a Chrome extension for like a wallet. And that's super cool because basically you get instant distribution. Like let's say you're somebody on social. For example, we had a blink where you can just go on my tweet and then you can stake to Helius directly from that link without doing anything else. And we got a good amount of stake from that. So now we're the number 2 validator on Solana, actually, which is not from that, but like it all adds up. So that's really cool. And it's a good playground. And it maybe shows also the difference in Solana versus other ecosystems in a sense, where the foundation is working to build application infrastructure and distribution infrastructure, as opposed to maybe the low-level core infrastructure for scaling or something like that. Not to say they don't do that, but there's a, let's say, disproportionate focus on apps. The second would be, to shill Helius and Light Protocol a little bit, would be ZK compression. So, and by the way, when we released this, people thought it was a rollup, which is just nonsense. It's not a rollup. It's a stateless accumulator. And basically the problem here is on Ethereum storage, and let's say the smart contracts are in one contract are tightly coupled. On Solana, they're separated out. So you store data, code, accounts, everything in a more modular way, and it's decoupled. And so, for example, let's say you want to mint 10,000 NFTs. Now, on Solana, compute is cheap, meaning transactions are cheap. Like you can make transactions a cheap way. But to hold those 10,000 NFTs, you need to allocate 10,000 accounts on the chain, which is not cheap because you need to pay the validators, hey, save some space for me, I'll pay you some rent, and you can store this there as long as I'm paying rent. And you can imagine when you do this for like 100,000 NFTs, it gets quite expensive, right? You have to not only pay to mint 10,000 NFTs in a compute sense, in a transaction sense, but you need to allocate 10 or 100,000 different accounts. And what compression does, ZK compression, is it takes those 100,000 accounts, compresses them into one account, and then links them with a Merkle root, and then uses ZK to compress the proof size. That's it. And with that, you're able to get something like 5,000 to 6,000x cost savings, which really helps because it's the final, or not the final, but one of the biggest bottlenecks on Solana. And what this also means is that validators who have to store all these accounts, obviously with hardware requirements on their RAM or disk, whatever, can now store much less data. And so state growth, this is a good kind of first step towards solving state growth, which is not as big a problem on Solana as it is on EVM, but it'll still become a problem. And so it's not even in mainnet yet, it's in testnet, but we've seen a lot of customers wanting to use it so far. And the beauty of it is that we didn't need to raise a round to do this. We didn't release a token. We didn't do any of these weird things that most, let's say, infrastructure projects have to do on other ecosystems. We just shipped it. That's it. And yeah, to be clear, it's not a roll-up. Okay. We can talk about that a bit more later. And the third one, obviously, is going to be FireDancer, right? So FireDancer is Solana's new validator client that's coming out. And it's actually, so we have a blog post on this at helius.dev/blog. You can kind of read up on it. It's super detailed. But basically, it is Jump Crypto, and they're rewriting the entire validator client from scratch in C and doing some bizarre, like massive optimizations to basically anything that can be optimized. In fact, I believe they even sped up like SHA-256 hashing algorithms that's used by the entire software industry, not just crypto. So like they're going pretty deep into this, rewriting the entire networking stack. And like the guy leading the project, Kevin Bowers, first of all, like PhD in plasma physics, worked at Bell Labs, has been doing this for like 20, 30 years. So he really knows his stuff. And they basically have the smartest engineers on Solana that I know, like Rishit Patel, Liam, etc., all working on this. And so the first version of this is called FrankenDancer, which will go live supposedly at Breakpoint, which is basically, it's called Frankendancer because it's the existing Solana Labs client, but with Firedancer's networking stack added on top of it. And that's important because networking stack was the cause of the congestion problems recently. And then once that goes well, hopefully, then the full thing kind of goes out. And it's cool because obviously, you know, performance, node requirements, whatever, that's all good. More independent teams working on kind of the same spec. That's cool. But perhaps the best part of it is that now there's no single security failure points, right? Like it's super rare for a bug to happen on both the Rust client and the C client at the same time. We'll see kind of the dynamics. Like, will it be like Onza and Firedancer kind of competing to push upgrades, or will it be much more collaborative, where like Firedancer is the default and then Onza just works as a backup? We'll see. I don't know how that plays out at all. But so those are the three things I'm most excited about. And then I guess 4 would be just Solana Breakpoint. It's going to be, I don't think I'm allowed to describe the format yet, but it's going to be a very good conference and from a lot of learnings from other conferences.
What do you think about the criticism that Jump Crypto is building this? Like, is there any legitimacy to that? I know it's like kind of been discussed before, but what are your thoughts?
I mean, it's open source software, so anybody can see what's being built out in the open. It's on GitHub. And by the way, people kind of have this understanding of Solana that's maybe a bit incorrect, where, for example, when Jito shut down their mempool, everybody was like, okay, no more sandwich on Solana, no more mempool because this is super hard to do and only Jito knows how to do it, etc. But then like 3 weeks after, all these private mempools started popping up, everybody started getting sandwiched. They're still getting sandwiched. And so there's actually a lot of smart people in dark foresty areas always looking at this stuff. We're an RPC provider and people use our nodes for pretty much anything on Solana. And so I probably have a different perspective on this, but like people are looking at the client. Everybody is trying to understand how it works and whatnot. And we're also writing a lot of research pieces on it. And then there's also the other side of this, which is like Jump is super cautious about this stuff. Like I'm not even sure they're allowed to do MEB on Solana. And like it's super hard to even get them on a podcast. Like they're extremely cautious in terms of being compliant and whatever adherent to all these things. And so I just cannot see them doing anything, you know, let's say too suspicious. The real suspicious people are the ones you don't even know on Solana that do some bizarre shit, which we can talk about later.
Yeah. Okay. Before we move to that, you're often and have been beating the drum about more apps, less infrastructure, get people to use these things. What apps, maybe you can say what apps you're excited about currently, and then maybe also what apps do you want to see to bring people on chain?
Yeah. So I've been saying this for roughly 4 years now, which is why I started Helius. It's literally the only purpose is to help app developers. One thing that I've been quite interested in recently is just SocialFi. I think people have, this is like a controversial topic for some reason, but like the existing network effect of the social giants like Twitter and like Snapchat or TikTok, whatever, are basically unbeatable. Like there's almost no way you can beat them. But if you look at some of these SocialFi apps like Friendtech during the first days and maybe even Farcast for a little bit, Fantasy, Time.fun, Pump.fun even, they are able to acquire users at an insane velocity and get a lot of capital and attention directed towards them. And then the problem becomes retention. But retention is an old Web 2 problem, Web 1 problem is just a business problem. And I think that can be solved. And so I was actually using Time.fun pretty religiously because, you know, I get a lot of DMs and whatnot every day and message requests. And it's like, okay, it'd be interesting if there's like some sort of market price on the time there, like tokenizing time, such that I can actually prioritize people who maybe value my time as well. And so it's like a good like win-win situation. So I like and then like with Solana mobile, because like consumer has to be mobile. Like you can't just do a PWA, but it's not going to be great. All serious consumer apps are mobile. And since Solana is also pushing mobile, I think there's some interesting integrations possible there, assuming they fix the problems with the old Solana phone, which was not good, to be completely honest. So that's one class. And then honestly, just doing the basics correctly. Like, I think everybody gets very bogged down with all these fancy conditionals. Like, okay, can we use this restaking layer and then add some X to it such that once Y happens, then we can release Z, which might solve that W problem or something. It's all super conditional. But fundamentally, I just want to go to the bar and pay for my beer with crypto, right? So like something super simple. And the bottleneck there is not infrastructure, which many people get this wrong, but the bottleneck there is regulation and just good old business building and good go-to-market. And people like kind of in crypto have a very flawed understanding of marketing where they think their market is like the set of people who want to make money, but that's just the entire world. That's not a market that you can target specifically, and you won't stand out because everybody else can just give other people money. You need to be super specific about who you're targeting, and I feel like that's just kind of been missing, although that's changing a little bit now. And then in terms of other types of apps, I do think, I'm not sure if this classifies as an app, but I think DePIN is still the most exciting thing I've seen in crypto. So decentralized physical infrastructure networks. There are still open questions about like the business margins and profitability and maybe long-term competition. But so for example, something like HiveMapper is basically a Google Maps competitor, and Google Maps is a giant. And instead of having like Google's own cars going around and mapping the world every, let's say, year or every like twice a year or something, and which causes these maps to be like relatively stale, what if you just gave everybody a dash cam and then people drive anyways, and then they just kind of map and then earn crypto as on the side? And the end result is you get actually much fresher maps, real-time maps, more community involvement because there's some economic incentives there as well. And then now the mapping experience, like let's say you pull up the HiveMapper map, is actually like inherently superior because it's newer data, fresher data, more active data, and there's a community. And you can actually build a business on top of that, right? Let's say you're a taxi company or something. And there's a bunch like that. There's obviously Helium. There is Render. There's something called Onakoi, which is like GPS positioning, which is like super niche, but a real use case. And so I think maybe to TLDR this, I think social, the basics such as like payments, and then DePIN, I think would be the things to double down on.
Yeah. Totally often talks about Solana is going to be NASDAQ on the blockchain. When you look at Solana, do you think of NASDAQ on the blockchain? Like, is this what Solana is optimizing? And it seems like the short answer to this is yes, but is this your vision of Solana as well? NASDAQ on the blockchain?
I don't particularly resonate with NASDAQ specifically. So maybe briefly, my background is actually in communications engineering. So I've always been interested in the communications networks, radios and stuff. And actually both the co-founders of Helius, or my two other co-founders of Helius, Nick and Liam, also did the same program. And so that's always been like a very interesting kind of design space and something we think about. And I mean, so the NASDAQ thing, I think, is sourced from Tolly's like traumatic story of trying to land a trade and not getting front run. And then now he's like, fuck these guys. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to take them down. I don't particularly care about financial data. I care about information flow. I think that's like the most important problem to solve. I wrote a post on this, which was heavily inspired by like Pappy McCormick's post on the end game of crypto is kind of capitalism, but like supercharged. I hate that word, but it's something like that. And basically the only way free markets work is if there's free information flow without like these weird arbitrary barriers in between the actors and agents. And it's actually, if you look, I don't want to get like too philosophical, but if you look like deeply and read a little bit, you'll kind of notice that all functioning systems that are like the best systems, like evolution, for example, requires decentralized information flow between the organisms and their environments. And there's not like one central thing that says like, this is how the decision must be made. Same with like capitalism, communism, right? Like you go North Korea, South Korea. And I fundamentally think crypto's role is to help improve the networks of the world to be more free information, to be full of free information flow, where you can't get like these giants controlling everything. There are times when it makes sense. Like, I don't think decentralizing everything is the answer, but I do think probably it's swayed too much to one direction. And so there's probably a better equilibrium to be found there. And so the way I think of Solana is like, okay, it's as least or as little parts as you need to enable that mission. I don't think it's the only way. I do think Ethereum, Bitcoin, all these other things also have a pretty good shot. In my, like, let's say, semi-thought out thesis is that everybody's kind of thinking about blockchains the wrong way, or like architectures the wrong way. They're like, do I build modular or monolithic? It's like, that doesn't matter at all. What matters is which use cases benefit the most from which architectures. If it's something like price discovery, like Tolly says, yeah, maybe Solana makes much more sense, and maybe you want all financial data, specifically financial data, flowing through Solana. But if it's like gaming data, like, I'm not convinced there's a reason that needs to be on Solana. It can easily be on an L2 or its own app chain. And so I fundamentally agree with Tolly on that, like, building this giant state machine where information flow between everywhere else in the world is like minimized in terms of latency, and you have like a large quorum size, so it's like super resilient. But I think it's much broader than financial data.
Let's talk a little bit about MEV stuff. All right, like Samani, this is another question I'm asking everybody here on out, right? Samani has this thesis that blockchains and block space will ultimately converge as to the margins, and as a result, the value of a blockchain is the MEV that it can generate. Thoughts on this, and then we can dig in more.
Well, I mean, it's certainly correct today, in some sense. Like, if you look at Solana's validator revenue, if you look at like Dan from BlockWorks, who's my co-host for Lightspeed, he'll tweet this out periodically that like Solana has surpassed Ethereum's economic, let's say, activity for validators. And most of that comes from MEV and priority fees. And so I think it's not obviously entirely the case today. There's still other factors. But I do think it's largely correct. And like, people like to like shit on MEV and say like, oh, it's just robbery and whatever, scam and all this. But it's like, arbitrage happens every day in all markets. Like, it's not like it's specific to crypto even. And so I think there's certainly maybe not a good side, but like, it's not as evil as people think. It kind of just is. And then what we can do is we can try to eliminate the maliciousness as much as possible. So like sandwiches, for example, are just a net bad. I mean, even Europe is trying to actually outlaw this directly. And I'm not sure how they're going to do this, but like, they're basically labeling it a crime. And so I'm having like these exchanges come up to me and they're like, what do we do about this? I'm like, I don't know how Europeans think. But like, so there's a lot of questions around that. And like, in a case where it is outlawed, it's like, does this thesis still hold? I don't know. Or maybe only certain forms are allowed. And so, I mean, I guess like, I would ask to people who disagree, like, what other form would the value accrue from, right? Like, people will say something like on Ethereum, it comes from using ETH as money on the L2s or something. But it's like, that's totally social. There's no real reason. I mean, like, you can use it, look at like DGen, which is an L3 on Base and Arbitrum, I believe, and they use their own token. So it's going to be kind of hard to enforce that in my view. And MEV is more, let's say, fundamental, where it's like, people will do it whenever there's economic activity. But I would never make a claim as strong as saying it's the only thing, or like it's going to be the only way that these blockchains generate revenue or something like that. But certainly currently today, it's the most important.
I think the counter argument, I guess, from like maybe the Ethereum side would be that the value security of their block space, right? Like, I'm giving their view, not necessarily mine, but like, the value of their block space is worth paying up for. And so validators can set a certain price and sell block space, and it be Ethereum block space. And so it's not a function of how much MEV necessarily that those validators can generate, but more that they have the ability, they have a 12-second monopoly on being able to sell block space. So I think that would be the counter argument. Do you think that Solana was, so like I have always like trolled sandwiches. Like I just like, first of all, and it's interesting you bring up that Europe is looking to outlaw them. Like I remember talking to Nesloban like a year and a half ago about this, and like he was like, look, like this is probably illegal. And I was like, yeah, it looks like it's probably illegal, right? And like this is an open permissionless network, anybody can do it, but this is like pretty bad. Like this is probably pretty close to insider trading. So I've long thought that like the solution to sandwiches is probably governments around the world saying you can't sandwich, and then the people in the dark forest who are going to sandwich are probably still going to sandwich. Do you think that Solana, to some extent, was critical of Ethereum and the MEV problems, and now is kind of like, ooh, this is happening on Solana as well? Like, do you think? Because I mean, I have seen some Solana people be quite critical of the extraction, and now we are seeing a lot of MEV generated on Solana as well.
Yeah. Before I answer that, maybe I'll quickly make a remark on the block space thing. That's actually a good point. And I mean, certainly that's super important. And actually, I brought this up at ETHCC during a debate, which was to say, like, I think one thing Ethereum that I like about Solana is that the way Tolly talks about like validator requirements is like, it's not all about supply. Like, let's say supply is equated to hardware accessibility. Like you can just get a node and run it anywhere on any internet. So that's one part of the equation, supply. But in an economy, obviously supply and demand have to be balanced. And if the capability of that hardware leads to a blockchain such that there's not valuable activity happening on top of it because of physical limits, well, then there's no demand, or maybe the demand and supply equilibrium is not great. As a result, then the value profitably is affected, right? And value capture is affected. And then now what you need to do is the value is somewhat leaked to the L2s in a sense. And so that's kind of the counter to that, which is to say, everybody's been focused super heavily on node accessibility, that they kind of forgot that it's the incentives to run the node that matter much more than just pure accessibility for running the node, right? Just because I can doesn't mean I should, doesn't mean I want to, right? I mean, I can go rent a cab right now, but why would I? I could just walk, right? You need to look at the incentives. Okay. So to the question about, so is the question like Solana folks were critical of Ethereum's value capture or MEV extraction, and then now the same thing is kind of happening on Solana? And like, what do I think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big criticisms of Ethereum, let's say, was the amount of sandwiching and sort of, like pernicious MEV. And now we are seeing this on Solana and it's increasing. Do you feel like maybe this was, I don't know, underestimated, or like, I don't know, any thoughts you have on that?
Oh, I mean, certainly it was underestimated. That's for sure. And I used to get really mad about this because people would just like, so when Jito made the announcement of sunsetting or suspending, let's say, their mempool because they were starting to detect these sandwiches, I was like one of the only ones, I might have been even the only one that was like, this is a wrong decision, because it's just going to happen, but it's not going to be Jito, and we're not going to know what's going to happen because there'll be like shady actors. And I think John Sharp actually agreed with that as well. So I wasn't the only one. But like, it was just a Band-Aid. Like, what needs to happen is, it depends how you define Solana, but the ecosystem is obviously a set of teams. So like Telegram bots use maybe Jupiter uses like some set of RPCs. Some of those RPCs might be, let's say, multi-chain teams that keep spamming transactions and don't give a shit about what happens to those transactions until they land. Some of them might be a bit more Solana aligned, let's say like Helius, where we don't do that, obviously. And so the problem is there's no like ecosystem aligned. There's no alignments from the ecosystem perspective to like solve or help reduce MEV. It can't just be Jito doing it. And I think Jito has done a lot to help with this, like a lot of visualization, explorers, education, like bots, detection mechanisms and all that. Us and then Triton have also been doing this as well. But like it's fundamentally the app level needs to kind of be like, okay, hold up, like, wait a minute, why are we letting this happen? And so then the incentives get a little weird. And so I do think certainly we were not ready for sure to deal with MEV stuff. Because I think like meme coin season and whatnot happens like quite fast. It was, I don't even quite remember how it happens, but like everything just happened super fast. And at the same time, congestion happened and like transactions started dropping. So it's okay, which problem do we solve first? And so maybe it got overlooked. But now we have a pretty strong focus, at least at Helius, obviously Jito as well, and some other teams that are raising to help eliminate it as much as possible. And it's also kind of a newer design space, right? Because Solana natively doesn't have a mempool. And so it wasn't clear how MEV attacks would really happen. Now we have a better understanding, obviously. And so it was just something we had to kind of see from the data.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Stake-weighted QoS. Can you just talk about this? Like, give like a simple overview first.
So let's say before stake-weighted QoS, the way Solana works is you have a bunch of RPC nodes, and those RPC nodes all forward transactions to the current block leader and the next few block leaders. So there's no like waiting area like a mempool where the validators actually pull from the mempool to pack the best block or something. And now you can probably already kind of see the problem, which is to say that everybody can just spam as many transactions as they want to the leader. And the leader needs to have some way of prioritizing what's high quality, low quality. Are these people even paying fees and whatnot? There's a lot that goes on there. But basically, most people, depending on who you ask, maybe view this as kind of like a Band-Aid. But basically, there needs to be some sort of quality of service of how the leader picks traffic. And stake-weighted QoS is super simple. It just says validators with X amount of stake get up to X% of bandwidth for sending transactions, right? So it's basically just an outer protocol because it's not inside the block. It's more like an implementation detail. It's a bandwidth market such that you have X amount of stake, which gives you X amount of bandwidth, up to X amount of bandwidth. And that's just to get to the leader, by the way. It's not like block space. Like you don't get X% of block space with the stake. You get X% of bandwidth to the block leader. Once it gets there, then, you know, it's unclear. I mean, priority fees help, but like as Eugene wrote about a while ago, local fee markets don't work perfectly. There's a lot of randomness present because the threads, like for example, you might send a transaction as multi-threaded and then one of the threads picks something up before something else, etc. So there's some chaos and jitter there. But fundamentally, that's what it is. It's worth noting that FireDancer does not implement stake-weighted QoS. So they think they can actually just handle the traffic, like the ingress, as much as you can kind of send to them. And obviously they'll have some other congestion control mechanisms. Helius is also working on like this traffic scoring validator tool where like if you're known, it's like reputation basically. Like if you're like a known entity that just is always spamming shit and basically you cause the validator rewards to be low, then those validators obviously have an incentive to not care about you. And maybe they'll prioritize higher paying customers or transaction senders.
You said that FireDancer doesn't have stake-weighted QoS, and I think I don't know, I sense a slight bit of skepticism in saying that. Like, do you think that FireDancer can handle just a barrage of just, you know, same thing that was happening before, which is like, you know, spamming the shit out of these like RPCs? Like, is this feasible? It's kind of interesting. I didn't know that actually with regards to FireDancer.
Well, so I haven't read the code. So that's the reason I'm skeptical is because I haven't seen exactly how it's supposed to work. But I mean, obviously they've thought about it. And so they've also, I mean, first of all, they were some of the first ones to flag the problem in the first place. So they definitely know what they're doing. Maybe I just didn't, because like Liam just, this is on Twitter, I said like, what are you going to replace stake-weighted QoS with? And he said, we can just handle traffic, but maybe that's just Liam shitposting. and it probably is. And so I imagine there's some sort of congestion control algos there that I'm just not aware of. Maybe they're just using like T or UDP with like a custom stack on top. So we'll just see. Like they definitely have something for it. Like you can't get around that in a sense, but the quality of service does not need to be stake weighted. It can be based on other things like reputation, I don't know, IP, like a bunch of other things.
Yeah. So when you say that you think stake-weighted QoS is like a band-aid, is that what you're thinking then, like reputation based? And also, I guess maybe the bigger question here is like, how do you feel about this philosophically? Like if we're starting to create permissioned entities that can just access this bandwidth, is this like a problem long term? Like for example, Max would be very vocal in saying that stake-weighted QoS is long run like a very centralizing force.
Yeah, I mean it certainly can be centralizing. It really depends on the amount of competition. I mean, you can kind of see we were like, I mean, obviously we started from zero, so we were the last place validator on Solana, and now we're the second validator on Solana, and that's only to acquire that stake to give developers bandwidth, because we're a developer company, to land transactions. Now, if there's like 5-6 other companies doing this, competing with us, then like the centralization really depends on the competition present, because the barrier to entry is permissionless. Like you can just spin up a node and acquire SOL. Or, I mean, and by the way, delegation is enshrined into Solana. So if you can convince people to stake with you, they can just do it without requiring like a Lido or a rocket pool. And so in that sense, I kind of agree it can be centralizing. I just don't think it is centralizing on its own. The way I think about it is just, it's like a reasonable default to start with. Like you already have stake, and so, it's a proof of stake network. And so it's a good kind of place to start to figure out some future iterations, which is kind of what everybody's doing right now anyways. So I do think it's a band-aid.
I saw somebody talking about this on Twitter and saying that Solana is going to become Helius-chain. And I don't know who it was, but they said Solana is now becoming Helius-chain. And my inclination is that is probably correct. But my counter to this is that I don't think it's that big of a deal. This will get people very upset. But I do think like the access to bandwidth, like, so I guess from like the way that I view this, right? Like in a blockchain, you have like proof of work obviously being hash rate, but like you have stake and everybody is allocated some monopoly over block space dependent on their stake. But now we're adding in an additional layer of like permissioned, and in this case, it's based on your stake, but like, as you were saying, like reputation based. But like, I also don't think this is the end of the world for what Solana's trying to do. It may not follow what I would like to see on something like Bitcoin, right? Like, I think that you don't want, like, one of Bitcoin's long like visions has been like you can spin up a node and broadcast a transaction directly to the mempool, and with a sufficient fee know that that's going to get picked up, right? Like, but I just don't see this really being as feasible on proof of stake chains. Like, this is my personal opinion. So yeah, like I wanted to ask you though. So sorry, that was just a bit of a digression. I wanted to ask you though. I assume you listened to the Tolly and Justin Drake debate. Did you have any like takeaways? Like, did anybody get anything really wrong? I mean, like, even some of our Solana friends were like, "Oh, Tolly, come on!" Like, about certain things, right? But like, it was quite interesting. Did you have any takeaways from that?
Okay,
yeah.
So yeah, really Helius-chain thing. I think people like severely overestimate how much influence we have. Like, it's an RPC provider. People can swap it out for other RPC providers, and then that's kind of it. Like, there's
but if you guys provide the best service consistently, which I think it sounds like you probably do.
Yeah, and that's good because it's a free market. Right. Other people are now incentivized to compete with us.
Yeah.
But like, anyway, I think people overstate that a little bit. I mean, if it was Helius-chain, then I'd have a much easier time raising a massive round, and people obviously have questions. Okay, in terms of the Justin Drake Tolly thing, I actually didn't watch it because I cannot stand to watch Bankless.
Okay.
But I did see parts of it, and Justin was asking me questions leading up to the debate just to learn more about Solana the whole time anyway.
Edge.
Yes. In terms of, Well, I think actually a good one would be, I asked Kyle Samani his thoughts on a bunch of the things that were asked on Lightspeed, and he basically disagreed with everything, but he had good kind of points backing it up. I don't agree with totally that economic security is a meme, but I get where he's coming from in a sense. He's just trying to say it's the highest possible cost, but there are lower costs. I don't think that means you should, ignore it. And maybe the fundamental point I'll make about that is that it doesn't matter what Tolly thinks about economic security, because the price of the token is not determined by that. It is determined by people using the chain and actually, let's say MEV, let's say if you agree with Kyle's thesis, and the valuability of block space and obviously speculation. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, we can cut it there. Thank you so much. I thought it was awesome.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me.